My ex-husband thought he'd walk away unscathed, but the court gave me everything he treasured. The soft glow of the morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains, illuminating the kitchen where a woman stood, her hands trembling slightly as she poured coffee into a ceramic mug. For 15 years, that kitchen had been her sanctuary, a space where she had prepared countless meals, cleaned spills, and organized every drawer with the precision of someone who found comfort in order. She had traded a promising career in marketing for this, the quiet life of a wife, supporting her husband's ambitions while her own dreams quietly faded into the background. At the time, it had felt like the right decision, one made from love and faith in their shared future. But lately, the silence in the house felt heavier, every room carrying an unspoken tension that wrapped around her chest and made it harder to breathe. The first signs were small, almost invisible to anyone not accustomed to paying attention to details. He would return home later than usual, his explanations brief and unconvincing. Business dinners, urgent client meetings, unforeseen delays, they stacked up until they formed a wall between them. She had always trusted him implicitly, brushing away the nagging voice inside her that whispered about changes she couldn't yet put into words. The cologne lingering on his shirts no longer smelled like the one she bought him every Christmas. There was a new sharpness in his voice, a new impatience in his posture, as if every word she spoke grated against some invisible nerve. The humiliation crept in slowly, like a draft under the door, chilling her from the inside. It was in the way he corrected her in front of his colleagues at dinner parties, his smile strained as if embarrassed to be seen beside her. It was in the dismissive glances when she asked about his day, the way his phone always seemed to light up with notifications the moment she entered the room. But the worst was the indifference, the cold, quiet void that had replaced the warmth they once shared. She felt like a relic of a life he no longer wanted, a reminder of the years before his success, the years he seemed determined to erase. At first, she tried harder, pouring her energy into making the home even more perfect, cooking meals that took hours, ironing his shirts until they were crisp and flawless. But nothing changed. Her efforts were swallowed whole by his apathy, and slowly, the realization settled in, she was invisible. The house, once a symbol of their shared dreams, had become her prison. And every room seemed to echo back the same unspoken truth, she was no longer enough. Even the way he looked at her had changed, his gaze sliding past her like she was part of the furniture. There were no fights, no accusations, no dramatic confrontations. Just the slow, agonizing erosion of everything she thought was real. She clung to the small routines, the morning coffee, the folded laundry, the notes she still tucked into his briefcase. But deep down, she knew those rituals were all that was left between them, fragile threads holding together a life already unraveling. The first real blow came at a company dinner, a lavish event celebrating a major contract win. She had dressed carefully, choosing a navy blue dress that once made him smile. She applied her makeup with trembling fingers, remembering how he used to call her beautiful even before she finished getting ready. But as they arrived, his hand resting lightly on her back felt more like a formality than affection. The room was filled with polished smiles and the clink of expensive glasses, but she noticed immediately how he distanced himself, moving ahead of her like they weren't together at all. It was subtle at first, the way he avoided introducing her, the way he redirected conversations when they mentioned spouses. But then, after a few glasses of wine, his mask slipped. "She's been at home for years," he said with a dismissive laugh, "keeping the house in order, I guess." The chuckles around the table were polite, but her skin burned as if they had all been laughing at her. Every word felt like a pin, pricking through the thin veil of dignity she had left. When someone asked if she worked, his answer was quick, no, she never really had a career. It was a lie, erasing the years she had spent building his website, managing his schedules, quietly handling all the details that let him shine. She sat there, her smile frozen, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. No one noticed, not even him. The conversations swirled around her, stories of promotions and accolades, the kind of successes she used to imagine for herself. But she had traded all of that for him, for love, for partnership. And now, she was nothing more than an accessory, the silent wife who had no story worth telling. When they left that night, she didn't speak. He didn't notice. Her humiliation had become so commonplace that it no longer even registered. The affair wasn't a sudden explosion but a slow, festering wound that finally split open. It was the perfume on his shirt, the unfamiliar shade of lipstick smudged on a collar, the hushed conversations that stopped the moment she entered the room. She had suspected for months, perhaps even longer, but suspicions were easier to ignore than truths. It wasn't until she found the receipt, a luxury resort far outside their usual destinations, that reality forced its way into her world. The reservation was for two, a weekend getaway labeled anniversary package, though it coincided with no date of theirs. Confronting him was a disaster. He didn't deny it, in fact, he seemed almost relieved. His expression was one of boredom, not guilt, as if her pain was an inconvenience he had anticipated. "You were never enough," he said, the words so casual they could have been about burnt toast. "You never understood ambition." He stood there, so certain of his own righteousness, as if his success justified every cruelty. "I need someone who fits the life I'm building," he added, as if she were a tool he had outgrown. Her humiliation was complete. Not only had she been replaced, but she was dismissed like a worn-out shoe. His affair wasn't a secret. He had paraded her successor at work events, introducing her with the pride he once reserved for his wife. The whispers followed her wherever she went, the discarded wife, the woman who couldn't keep her husband, the invisible presence clinging to a life that had already moved on. When the divorce papers arrived, she signed them with hands that shook so badly, the ink smeared. He was leaving her with nothing, no home, no savings, no dignity. The house was no longer hers, and the keys felt heavy in her palm as she stood on the front steps for the last time. The home she had nurtured for over a decade was now just a hollow shell, its warmth extinguished by betrayal and absence. The suitcases at her feet held all she was allowed to keep, some clothes, a few sentimental trinkets, and memories she wasn't sure she wanted. The car waiting at the curb belonged to a friend, the only person who hadn't faded into silence when the news spread. She had always thought divorce was something dramatic, with screaming matches and broken dishes. But her reality was quieter, almost clinical. There were no apologies, no last-minute declarations of regret. There was only a text message confirming the mover's arrival, a final insult delivered without even looking her in the eye. As she stepped into the car, her hands trembling in her lap, she realized the most humiliating part wasn't losing the house or the lifestyle. It was losing the illusion that she had ever mattered to him at all. The first night in her friend's guest room felt like floating in unfamiliar water, her mind unable to settle on any shore. Every creak of the house felt like an accusation, every silence filled with the ghosts of her own self-doubt. She had become a woman defined by her absence, no longer a wife, no longer a partner, no longer someone worth remembering. The humiliation clung to her skin like a cold sweat, reminding her with every breath that she had been discarded, not even worthy of a fight. The first hearing took place on a Wednesday morning, the kind of gray, overcast day that seemed to mirror the dull ache in her chest. She stood at the courthouse entrance, her breath clouding in the air, clutching the edges of her coat as if the thin fabric could shield her from the weight of what was to come. Inside the courtroom, her ex-husband sat confidently at the defendant's table, his expensive suit pristine, his fingers idly tapping against the polished wood. Beside him, his new girlfriend perched like an ornament, perfectly manicured, lips curled into a condescending smile every time their eyes met. The moment the proceedings began, her ex's attorney wasted no time painting her as a dependent, someone who contributed nothing, a burden who had leached off her husband's hard work. Each word landed like a slap, reducing years of silent sacrifices into a caricature, the lazy housewife with no ambition. The lawyer's voice dripped with disdain, listing vacations taken, dinners enjoyed, all framed as indulgences paid for solely by her husband's brilliance. The truth, her truth, had no place in the glossy narrative they spun, the nights she stayed up managing household budgets when money was tight, the networking events where she played hostess to land his first contracts, the quiet sacrifices that built the foundation he now stood on. Every stolen glance between her ex-husband and his new partner was a reminder that, to them, this was all a performance, a final act in which she was nothing more than a pitiful relic from a life he'd long outgrown. Her own lawyer was a stranger, someone she found after days of scrolling through online directories, too ashamed to ask for recommendations from the few friends who still answered her calls. He was kind but detached, his file on her thin compared to the thick binder her ex's team had prepared. When her turn came to speak, her voice shook, not from nerves, but from the sheer weight of the humiliation pressed onto her chest. She tried to explain her role in their life together, the unseen hours poured into supporting his career, the personal ambitions she had shelved to ensure his dreams could thrive. But against the backdrop of polished legal arguments and rehearsed testimony, her words sounded weak even to her own ears, like a distant echo no one cared to hear. The judge listened politely, but her ex-husband's smirk never wavered. Every time she spoke, his lawyer found a way to twist her words, making her sound bitter, resentful, and desperate to claim what she hadn't earned. The girlfriend sat silently, though the occasional glance at her manicure spoke louder than any insult could. The worst part wasn't the lies, it was how effortless they made it seem, reducing her entire marriage to a transaction where her contributions had no measurable value. As the first day ended, she left the courthouse with her lawyer's polite reassurance ringing hollow in her ears, knowing full well that the truth was never the point. Perception mattered more, and in their eyes, she was already defeated. The following hearings blurred together, each more painful than the last. Her ex-husband grew bolder, slipping casual insults into his statements, calling her outdated, irrelevant, incapable of understanding the complexities of his business empire. Every comment drew polite laughter from his side of the courtroom, a cruel chorus that followed her out of the building and into the cold afternoon air. Even the court clerk seemed to avoid her gaze, as if proximity to failure was contagious. The new girlfriend made sure to stand close enough for her diamond bracelet to catch the light, a shimmering reminder of everything she had lost, not just materially, but the dignity stripped away piece by piece. With every new piece of evidence presented, it became clear that her financial future was hanging by a thread. The accounts, the properties, even the retirement funds she thought were shared, all strategically structured to exclude her. She had signed papers over the years without question, trusting in a man who now stood across the room, smiling as her world collapsed. Even the modest savings account in her own name had been siphoned off, under the guise of household expenses, leaving her with barely enough to pay for gas and groceries. Sitting in the cold plastic chair beside her lawyer, she realized she wasn't just fighting for money. She was fighting to prove that her existence had mattered. Outside the courthouse, the humiliation followed her like a shadow. Her name became a whispered punchline at social gatherings she was no longer invited to, the discarded wife who had lost everything because she couldn't keep up. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her, unable or unwilling to acknowledge the wreckage of her life. Even her own family's support felt fragile, their calls filled with awkward pauses and half-hearted reassurances that things would somehow work out. But deep down, they saw her the way everyone else did, a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happened when a woman placed all her trust in the wrong man. Her ex, on the other hand, seemed to thrive on her downfall, his confidence growing with each court victory. He spoke about her as if she were a stranger, someone he barely remembered, a footnote in his story of personal triumph. His new partner's Instagram filled with snapshots of luxury vacations, designer shopping sprees, and romantic dinners, a glossy highlight reel that made her feel not just discarded, but utterly replaceable. Every post was a reminder that she had been written out of her own life, her place in their shared history erased as thoroughly as her name from their joint accounts. The final blow came when her lawyer explained how little was left to fight for. The prenuptial agreement she barely remembered signing, waved off at the time as a formality, now stood as an impenetrable wall, protecting nearly everything her husband had accumulated. The house, the cars, the savings accounts, all shielded, all just out of reach. All she had left were a handful of personal items and the clothes she managed to pack before the locks were changed. But it wasn't the loss of money that stung the most. It was the realization that the life she thought they had built together had been little more than an illusion, a house of cards built on her belief in a man who had never truly valued her. Even the judge's brief words of sympathy felt like a formality, a hollow gesture meant to soften a ruling that left her with nothing. The legal process was complete, but the humiliation lingered, a constant companion in every quiet moment. Her ex-husband walked out of the courtroom without a backward glance, hand in hand with his new partner, their matching smiles glowing with the certainty of victory. Alone in the echoing hallway, she stood rooted in place, no longer sure who she was without the title of wife, no longer sure where her life would lead now that her role in his had been so cruelly erased. The day after the final hearing, she found herself sitting at the worn kitchen table in her friend's house, staring at the envelope that contained the court's final ruling. Her fingers traced the edges, trembling slightly at the weight of everything it represented, a legal declaration that her worth had been quantified and discarded. The morning sunlight cast a faint glow over the papers, illuminating the cold language that defined her as little more than a dependent spouse entitled to scraps. Her friend's sympathy was palpable, but no words could soften the humiliation of knowing that her entire contribution to the marriage had been reduced to a number too insignificant to secure her future. That same afternoon, between sips of reheated coffee, her friend quietly slid a business card across the table, a young lawyer's name printed in plain black ink. "She's fresh out of law school," her friend said gently, "but she has a reputation for fighting cases no one else wants." Desperation made her pick up the card, even though part of her had already accepted defeat. The call was brief, the lawyer's voice bright with cautious optimism. "Let me look at everything," the young woman said, her confidence jarring after months of being told there was nothing left to fight for. Sometimes, the smallest detail changes everything. For the first time in months, the faintest flicker of hope stirred beneath the heavy weight of her humiliation. They met at a small cafe, where the lawyer arrived with a notebook and a laptop, her dark hair pulled back into a practical ponytail. She listened intently, her pen moving swiftly across the page as the woman recounted years of invisible labor, the unpaid work of building a life that had never been acknowledged in court. The lawyer asked for everything: receipts, emails, even handwritten notes left on the refrigerator over the years. "Anything that proves you were more than just a bystander," she explained, her tone matter-of-fact but not unkind. Digging through boxes and files, she unearthed fragments of a life she had tried to forget, faded invoices for home repairs she had arranged, travel itineraries she had planned, even old business emails drafted from her laptop while her husband took the credit. It was during one of these late-night searches that she stumbled across the file, an old folder tucked into the back of a drawer, its edges worn and creased. Inside were the documents from the early days of his business, when success was still a distant dream and every expense required approval from both of them. There were signed agreements, handwritten notes detailing strategy sessions conducted at their kitchen table, and, most importantly, a financial record showing the initial investment had come directly from an inheritance left by her grandmother. The money had been hers, the seed capital for the empire her husband now claimed as entirely his own. Her hands shook as she showed the file to the lawyer, who sat back in her chair with a slow, deliberate smile. "This," the lawyer said softly, "changes everything." The discovery of the inheritance wasn't just a legal breakthrough, it was a vindication of everything she had felt but had been too afraid to voice. For years, her ex-husband had painted her as a passive passenger, someone who had reaped the rewards of his ambition without contributing anything of value. But those pages told a different story, one of quiet sacrifice, of inherited family wealth redirected to fund his dreams, of financial decisions made together before he rewrote the narrative to erase her completely. The humiliation that had lived under her skin for so long began to shift, replaced by something sharper and harder, not anger exactly, but a resolve that felt foreign after so many years of silence. The lawyer's excitement was infectious, her mind racing with possibilities as she plotted the strategy for their next court appearance. "This isn't just about money," she explained, her pen tapping against the table. "This is about ownership of the business, of the narrative, of your own life." The woman sat silently, her hands folded in her lap, uncertain how to hold the sudden influx of hope. But as the lawyer laid out the plan, reopening discovery, challenging asset transfers, exposing the truth, a sense of purpose began to anchor itself in her chest. For the first time in months, she wasn't just surviving. She was fighting for the right to exist on her own terms. The next hearing felt different from the start. Her ex-husband's confidence was still there, but his new lawyer, older, sharper, with a polished veneer that barely concealed his contempt, seemed less certain. As the young lawyer presented the newly uncovered documents, the courtroom shifted, the polished narrative her ex-husband had so carefully constructed cracking under the weight of undeniable facts. The judge leaned forward, examining the inheritance documents with growing interest, his questions directed not at her but at her ex-husband, whose composure faltered for the first time. The girlfriend's presence, usually a source of silent humiliation, now felt insignificant, her carefully curated image of effortless glamour no match for the cold weight of financial records and legal agreements. Every signature, every joint decision, every dollar traced back to her inheritance served as proof that the life they had built wasn't his alone. The judge's questions grew sharper, his tone more skeptical, until even her ex-husband's polished smile began to slip. When the lawyer finally rested her case, the silence that followed was heavy with implication, not just for the financial settlement, but for the story her ex-husband had told the world about who he was and how he had succeeded. The shift in power was subtle but unmistakable. For the first time, her ex-husband wasn't entirely in control of the story being told. The judge ordered a full audit of the business finances, tracing every transaction back to its origin, a process that would strip away the carefully constructed illusion of his sole genius. The girlfriend's smile dimmed, her perfectly manicured fingers curling into her palm as she realized this wasn't going to be the quick victory they had anticipated. Outside the courthouse, the air felt different, lighter somehow, as if the weight of humiliation had loosened just enough to allow her to stand a little taller. The lawyer's excitement was tempered by caution, reminding her that there was still a long road ahead. But the woman felt something she hadn't in months, the flicker of self-worth, the sense that she wasn't just the discarded wife, the silent shadow behind her husband's success. She was someone with a story of her own, a story that was finally beginning to be heard. And as she walked down the courthouse steps, the humiliation that had clung to her like a second skin began to peel away, leaving something raw but undeniable in its place, the quiet, steady hum of her own voice reclaiming itself. The following weeks were filled with legal motions, filings, and the constant unraveling of secrets her ex-husband had buried under layers of corporate accounts and financial misdirection. Each document uncovered by her young lawyer was like a brick pulled from the foundation of the life he had built, a life balanced on the convenient omission of her sacrifices and the quiet theft of her inheritance. Bank statements, property deeds, and even emails detailing early financial decisions painted a picture her ex had worked hard to obscure. With each discovery, the narrative he so confidently presented to the world began to splinter, and she found herself in unfamiliar territory, not just a victim anymore, but a witness to her own quiet power finally being acknowledged. Court hearings no longer felt like funerals for her dignity. They became battlegrounds where the truth had weight, where her voice, even through the measured tones of her attorney, was finally heard. Her ex-husband's composure, so polished and effortless in the beginning, was fraying at the edges. The new girlfriend, once a beacon of smug triumph, now avoided eye contact, her fingers tracing imaginary patterns on the table as if trying to distract herself from the shifting tide. Though no verdict had been delivered yet, the courtroom itself felt different, no longer a stage for her humiliation, but a space where her existence, her contributions, her sacrifices, were becoming undeniable. The moment her lawyer called the first unexpected witness, her ex-husband's knuckles whitened against the edge of the table. It was a former colleague, one of the men who had once attended strategy sessions at their dining table, back when the business was still a fragile dream. The man's memory was clear, his testimony unshakable, how the wife, often dismissed as merely the hostess, had in fact drafted marketing proposals, proofread contracts, and even made introductions that secured their earliest clients. It was the first crack in the wall her ex had built between her and the truth of her own contributions. More witnesses followed, former neighbors who remembered her late-night work sessions, old friends who had quietly distanced themselves when the divorce turned into spectacle, and even a few business partners who reluctantly admitted they'd only signed deals after being charmed by the warmth and competence she brought to every negotiation. Piece by piece, the image of her as a passive beneficiary crumbled. The court saw not just a housewife clinging to a man's success, but a woman whose invisible labor had been essential to the empire's rise. For the first time, she sat with her back straight, no longer weighed down by shame, no longer shrinking beneath the distorted version of her own life. The new girlfriend's discomfort grew with each revelation, her grip on her designer purse tightening as witnesses confirmed that the wealth and success she admired hadn't been built solely by the man at her side. The glossy facade of effortless success, the life of yachts, luxury vacations, and perfectly curated social media posts, was being dismantled piece by piece, replaced with the undeniable truth that the foundation of that empire had been laid by the woman her boyfriend had discarded. Humiliation, once her constant companion, now seemed to shift, finding new hosts in the people who had believed in their own superiority. Her ex-husband's frustration boiled over in the hallways, where his whispered arguments with his lawyer could be heard just outside the courtroom door. His temper, once hidden behind charm, surfaced in bursts of irritation every time her lawyer stood to present new evidence. But no tantrum or legal maneuver could erase the paper trail they had uncovered. Every dollar tracked back to her inheritance, every client relationship built on connections she had fostered, every tax loophole exploited through joint filings they had once made together. She wasn't just reclaiming her dignity, she was rewriting the story he had so confidently written without her. There was no singular moment of triumph, no dramatic gavel strike that wiped away years of humiliation. The shift was gradual, a slow rebalancing of power that unfolded over the course of weeks. It was in the subtle softening of the judge's gaze, in the way the court clerk no longer avoided her eyes, in the careful way the opposing counsel began choosing his words. The woman who had been introduced as a discarded, irrelevant housewife was now understood as something far more, a partner who had been written out of her own life story, but who had fought her way back into the narrative. When her ex-husband took the stand, his answers were clipped, his confidence undercut by the weight of evidence and testimony. His attempts to dismiss her as petty or vindictive no longer found traction. The judge, having seen the full picture, now asked sharper questions, ones that forced her ex to confront his own convenient revisions of their shared history. The new girlfriend, so effortlessly confident in the early days, now sat with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her gaze fixed somewhere far from the woman she once mocked. Though the ruling was still days away, the air in the courtroom had changed, no longer suffocating, no longer pressing her into silence. The final day of testimony ended with an unexpected twist. Her lawyer introduced a document that even she had forgotten existed. It was a handwritten note, a simple message her ex-husband had left on their kitchen table in the early years of his business, thanking her for believing in him when no one else did. It was informal, almost silly in its simplicity, but it was undeniable, a confession, in his own handwriting, that her support had been the cornerstone of everything he had built. The judge read it silently, the courtroom holding its breath as the words hung in the air like a ghost of their past life. Her ex-husband's lawyer objected, but the damage had already been done. The note wasn't just evidence, it was the final, unshakable proof that her contributions had mattered, that her sacrifices had been real. For the first time, her ex-husband couldn't look at her. The silence between them was no longer filled with smug superiority, but with the uncomfortable weight of truth finally unearthed. When the court adjourned for the day, she walked out into the crisp afternoon air, no longer invisible, no longer drowning in shame. The humiliation wasn't gone entirely, but it was no longer hers to carry alone. The ruling came on a rainy afternoon, the soft patter of rain against the courthouse windows creating a steady rhythm that matched the pounding of her heart. She sat with her hands clasped in her lap, her fingers trembling slightly as the judge began reading the decision. Her ex-husband leaned back in his chair, his confidence a brittle mask that cracked with every word. The court recognized her contributions, financial, emotional, and logistical, not as background noise, but as essential to the business's foundation. The property division, once skewed heavily in his favor, was recalculated to reflect the true origins of their wealth. Half was hers, including assets her ex had deliberately shielded through shell companies and quiet transfers. The courtroom was silent except for the rustling of papers and the judge's calm, deliberate voice. Every financial threat her lawyer had traced, from the initial inheritance deposit to the strategic tax filings made in both their names, was acknowledged. The house, the vacation property, even the small cabin where they had once spent their earliest anniversaries, all placed under her rightful ownership. Her ex-husband's face was stone, but the furious twitch in his jaw betrayed him. The girlfriend's expression flickered from disbelief to disdain, her carefully curated future unraveling alongside his facade of effortless success. The woman, once crushed beneath the weight of humiliation, sat taller, her silence no longer born of shame, but of quiet triumph. The moment the hearing ended, her ex-husband's carefully restrained fury erupted. His voice, always so measured in public, cracked with frustration as he accused her of greed, of rewriting history to paint herself the victim. The judge's gavel silenced him, but the damage was already done, his outburst laid bare for everyone to see. The same man who once belittled her for being too meek, too insignificant, now stood trembling with rage at the realization that she had taken back control of the narrative he had shaped. The young lawyer stood beside her, calm and composed, the embodiment of the very strength her ex had always insisted she lacked. Outside the courtroom, cameras flashed and journalists hovered, drawn by the unexpected twist in what had once seemed like a straightforward divorce case. The new girlfriend, whose presence had been so pointedly flaunted in the beginning, now stood awkwardly to the side, her manicured nails tapping against her phone in a frantic rhythm. Her ex-husband's voice lowered to a furious whisper, his accusations growing more desperate, but the woman no longer needed to respond. Every insult, every effort to diminish her, had already been answered, not with words, but with the undeniable weight of evidence, of truth carved from years of silence and sacrifice. In the days following the ruling, the legal transfers began. The keys to properties she hadn't set foot in for months were handed back to her, each one a symbol of the life she had helped build, the life she had been so cruelly erased from. The beachfront house, once their shared sanctuary, now stood empty, stripped of the curated glamour her ex and his girlfriend had layered over it. The pool, the designer furniture, the luxury appliances, all purchased with wealth rooted in her family's legacy, all hers again. Walking through the halls, she could still see traces of her old life, but they no longer stung. They were just echoes, reminders of who she had been, not who she was becoming. The business, too, bore her fingerprints in ways her ex could no longer deny. Though she chose not to pursue ownership, some battles were not worth fighting, her financial stake was undeniable. The accounts, once siphoned into obscurity, were now open to her. The shares, the investment returns, the profits, they no longer belonged solely to the man who had mocked her as useless. His anger no longer touched her, his voice no longer dictated her worth. With every signature on every document, she reclaimed not just assets, but pieces of herself, the parts he had tried to diminish until there was nothing left but silence. The new girlfriend's departure was almost predictable, though the timing surprised even her. It was barely a week after the final ruling when the young woman packed her designer bags and left, slipping out of the house her ex no longer owned without so much as a goodbye. The life of luxury she had been promised had crumbled, and with no more lavish vacations or limitless credit cards, her loyalty dissolved just as easily. Her ex-husband, once the picture of arrogant success, stood alone in the driveway, shouting after the woman who didn't even glance back. The neighbors watched from behind curtains, their curiosity mingled with thinly veiled satisfaction. The woman stood across the street, unseen by her ex, watching the scene unfold. There was no satisfaction in seeing him abandoned, only a strange, hollow sense of finality. He was the same man who had humiliated her, the same man who had treated her like a burden. But now, without the wealth and the curated image that once protected him, he was just a man, small, angry, and exposed. The humiliation that had been her constant companion no longer clung to her skin. It belonged to him now, wrapped around him like a second layer of clothing he could never remove. The first night in her own home felt unfamiliar, even though it was a house she had once called hers. The silence no longer felt heavy, no longer filled with unsaid words and invisible accusations. It was hers again, not as a symbol of what she had lost, but as a canvas for what she could build. She walked through each room slowly, tracing her fingers along the furniture, the walls, the windows that had framed so many moments of her old life. The echoes of humiliation no longer haunted the space, they had been replaced by something quieter, gentler. Possibility. She slept that night with the windows open, the ocean breeze brushing against her skin. The fear of being seen as a failure, the shame of being cast aside, no longer held her captive. There would still be difficult days, moments where doubt crept in, but they would no longer define her. She had been erased, humiliated, discarded, but she had survived. More than that, she had reclaimed herself from the wreckage. And as the waves crashed against the shore, she realized the house wasn't just a house. It was proof that she had always been more than someone's wife. She was her own story, finally ready to be told. The first week in her newly reclaimed life passed slowly, each day a mixture of unfamiliar freedom and the lingering weight of old wounds. She found herself waking before dawn, out of habit, but without the sense of urgency that had once driven her to perfect every corner of the house for a man who barely noticed her efforts. The silence no longer felt oppressive, but open, like a blank page waiting to be filled. Instead of planning meals or polishing floors, she spent mornings on the deck, her coffee cradled between her palms, watching the sky shift from gray to gold. The quiet gave her space to remember who she had been before her identity became tied to someone else's ambitions, the girl who had once wanted to write, to travel, to leave her own mark on the world. One afternoon, while unpacking boxes she hadn't touched in years, she found a worn notebook tucked between old sweaters, her journal from the early years of marriage, when hope had still been enough to paper over the cracks. The pages were filled with ideas for stories, business plans, and daydreams of things she wanted to create, all left behind in favor of his dreams. Each entry was a small window into the version of herself she had locked away, believing there was no space for her desires alongside his. The realization was painful, but freeing. She had been absent from her own life for so long, but now, the life in front of her belonged entirely to her. There was no one to diminish her voice, no one to rewrite her story. The next chapter would be hers alone. The first step toward reclaiming her purpose came unexpectedly, in a conversation with her lawyer over coffee. They were reviewing the final transfer of assets, the young attorney beaming with pride at the unlikely victory they had pulled from the ashes of her marriage. "You should do something with this," the lawyer said, almost offhandedly. "There are so many women who go through the same thing, invisible until they fight back." The idea lingered long after the conversation ended, following her through the halls of her house, through the evenings spent sorting through legal files and correspondence. She had once believed her story was hers alone, a private humiliation too raw to share. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized how many other women's voices had been silenced just like hers. She started small, writing down pieces of her experience, not as a diary, but as a guide for women who might one day need it. Tips on tracking finances, gathering evidence, understanding legal jargon that lawyers often assumed clients already knew. Her words weren't polished, but they were honest, filled with the hard-earned knowledge that came from being erased and then forced to fight for her own existence. Slowly, the idea took shape, not just a personal project, but something larger, a resource for women who had been told their contributions were worthless. With each page she wrote, she chipped away at the shame that had once defined her. It was no longer just her story, it was a lifeline for the women still trapped in silence. Her days took on a new rhythm, one built not around someone else's expectations, but around her own sense of purpose. Mornings were spent writing and researching, afternoons dedicated to connecting with other women who had lived through similar betrayals. What began as a quiet project in her living room slowly grew into something larger, a small network of women sharing their stories, pooling resources, and building the kind of support system she had once desperately needed. For the first time in years, her voice wasn't just heard, it was valued. Each story she heard, each woman she helped navigate the labyrinth of divorce law, became a reminder that her pain had not been in vain. Evenings were no longer filled with rehearsed smiles at business dinners where she had been invisible. Now, they were spent in conversation with women finding their strength, with calls from journalists interested in the growing movement she hadn't realized she'd started. Her humiliation, once her most defining experience, became the very foundation of her strength. With every woman who reclaimed her dignity, who refused to disappear into silence, the woman felt her own spirit grow stronger. Her ex-husband's voice, once the loudest in her mind, faded into irrelevance. There was no need for revenge, her existence, thriving and purposeful, was proof enough that he had never truly broken her. The encounter happened unexpectedly, in the aisle of a grocery store, a place so ordinary it almost felt surreal. She reached for a carton of eggs at the same moment he did, their fingers brushing for an instant before they both froze. Her ex-husband stood before her, no longer the confident man who had once strutted into courtrooms and parties with his arm draped around his new girlfriend. His hair, once meticulously styled, was unkempt, his suit rumpled, as though it had been hastily thrown on. For a moment, they just stared at each other, the weight of years compressed into a few silent seconds. He tried to speak, but no words came. There was no apology, no sudden confession of regret, just awkward silence and the unmistakable flicker of discomfort in his eyes. She didn't need him to say anything. The roles had shifted, the balance of power quietly realigned. She no longer needed his validation, his remorse, or his understanding. With a slight nod, she took her eggs and walked past him, leaving him standing in the aisle like a ghost from a life she no longer lived. His humiliation was no longer hers to carry. His failure to see her worth had become his own burden, one she no longer felt compelled to ease. On the anniversary of her divorce, she stood on the balcony of the beachfront house, the same house where she had once felt invisible, watching the tide roll in under a sky painted with the last light of day. The house itself had changed, no longer a symbol of everything she had lost, but a monument to everything she had reclaimed. The silence no longer suffocated. It soothed. There were no ghosts here anymore, only the quiet comfort of knowing she had survived the worst and built something beautiful from the rubble. Her story, once written by someone else's hand, now belonged fully to her. There was no neat ending, no perfect resolution where every scar faded and every hurt dissolved. But there was peace, not the absence of pain, but the presence of strength. Her humiliation, once the center of her existence, was now a distant echo, a reminder of how far she had come. She was no longer just the discarded wife, the woman left with nothing. She was a builder, a fighter, a voice that refused to be silenced. And as the waves washed over the shore, she whispered a quiet promise to herself: she would never again be made to disappear. Her story had only just begun.